Welcoming you all here to 19 Washington Square North, NYU Abu Dhabi's home here in New York. For those of you who are new to NYUAD or to the Institute, I just wanted to spend a couple minutes telling you about what we do. Over the last decade, I should say, the Institute has established itself as a center of scholarly community for Abu Dhabi, the UAE, and the Gulf. And as an extension of the work we do in Abu Dhabi, the research we support, and the programs we organize, we also organize a series of programs here in New York. These programs range from research-based conferences and workshops to public lectures, panel discussions, and programs like the one we're here for tonight. If you have any suggestions for programs of this kind, please feel free to be in touch. I should add that it's not just the Institute that hosts programs here, but there are other opportunities through which your research can get supported or programs can get sponsored. I'd like to mention in particular the newly announced 19 Washington Square North Faculty Fellowship Program, which is a collaboration between the NYU Provost's Office and the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. And it's directed by Ann Morning, the academic director of 19 Washington Square North and associate professor of sociology. Oh, sure. Sorry. If you have any questions about programs 19, the Institute, feel free to reach out to Ann or to myself. And on that note, I will turn it over to Ann to introduce our guest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. So I'm Ann Morning. I am the brand new academic director here at 19 Washington Square North. But actually this evening I am channeling Philip Kennedy of the Abu Dhabi Institute. He was supposed to be with us. He couldn't be here this evening at the last minute because of a cold. So I am stepping into his shoes, and I'm delighted to do it for my old friend Natalie Putz. So Natalie is a cultural anthropologist, and she's an associate professor of Arab Crossroads Studies at NYU Abu Dhabi, and she goes back quite a while. She has been teaching at NYU Abu Dhabi since 2010. And I should add, on a very personal note, I have had the pleasure many times in my own teaching at Abu Dhabi since 2012. I've had the pleasure many times of asking her to come in and step in for me to come speak to my classes in Abu Dhabi, and she's just always a really compelling speaker. So I'm really looking forward to having her again with us here at 19 Washington Square North this evening. Now, Natalie's research interests focus on forced migration, displacement and immobility, also conservation and development, and more generally, questions of identity and heritage in the Arab world and the Western Indian Ocean region. Her published work examines the effects of international regulatory regimes on the marginalized communities that they intend to protect, including refugees, migrants, and ethnic and linguistic minorities. As we will learn more about this evening, Natalie is the author of Islands of Heritage, Conservation and Transformation in Yemen, which next month is going to be awarded the American Anthropological Association's Middle East Section Book Award. So congratulations on that honor. And she's also the co-editor of the volume, The Deportation Regime, Sovereignty, Space, and the Freedom of Movement, an unfortunately very timely issue. Right now, this year, Natalie has the pleasure of spending a year at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Study, and they have the pleasure of hosting her there, where she is working on a book on Yemeni refugees and Ethiopian migrants in the Horn of Africa. So with the tentative working title, Gate of Tears, Migration and Impasse in Yemen and the Horn of Africa, this work evaluates the impact of the UNHCR's new Global Compact on Refugees in Djibouti, one of the pilot countries for the UN's comprehensive refugee response framework. So you can see that in her research as a cultural anthropologist, Natalie is bridging many topics, but always with a real clear contemporary relevance. So on that note, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Natalie Putz.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you everybody for being here. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces. So yes, this is where I started off. In fact, I wish you hadn't said how long ago, but this is where I did start writing this book. But I've been living in Abu Dhabi since 2011. However, my first visit there was in 2005 in search of a woman who had been banished from this Indian Ocean island called Soqotra in the 1960s after having been accused by a local medicine man of being a witch. Now, this was not uncommon. As recently as the 60s, Soqotran women accused of witchcraft were tested by ordeal. If they sank, they were innocent and quickly hauled back up from being thrown overboat. If they were floated, they were guilty and banished via the first passing dhow. In some years, as many as 15 to 20 women, that may not sound like a lot, but the population in the 60s was about 11 to 13,000. As many as 15 to 20 women a year were tried and deported, many of them ending up in the Trucial states, where they married into Soqotran communities across the sea, and from where they ended up sustaining their family members back at home. What I find interesting is not just this strange twist of fate that turned a banished Soqotran pastoralist into a relatively wealthy, affluent Emirati citizen and patron, but how this story is emblematic of the ironic twist that turned what was once deemed Arabia deserta into today's booming cities, home to today's booming cities, and what turned Arabia Felix, or fortunate, felicitous Arabia, into today's ailing Yemen. It is a story, in other words, about the transformations that simultaneously connect Yemen's Soqotra Archipelago to the Arab Gulf and also distinguish it from it. And these are connections that I'm going to return to during the talk. So, as I said, I'm very pleased to return here to 19 Washington Square North to talk about this book that started here in some form, which is an ethnographic study of the implementation, impact, and overlap of conservation, development, and heritage projects in Soqotra. This multi-pronged focus was necessary, I argue, because heritage is not an isolated enterprise. One of the book's central claims is that because heritage discourses, materials, and practices circulate regionally, globally, and through time, we cannot fully understand their impacts, or their origins for that matter, without evaluating them in the context of other development, conservation, and tutelary projects that have come before and alongside them. Another central argument is that far from being, a merely conservative project, the protection of heritage can have profoundly transformative effects. This is significant because heritage projects in the Arab world tend to be top-down, state-funded, and expert-curated affairs. In the Arab Gulf states, where heritage is a booming industry, the breakneck construction of futuristic, cosmopolitan, and global cities has been scaffolded by the production of traditional, tribal, and homogeneous pasts. Scholars interested in these heritage festivals, museums, sports, and pageantries, and for those of you who've been to Abu Dhabi, these are very familiar sites, have rightly criticized their erasures of national socioeconomic diversity, pre-national ethnic hybridity, and centuries-long cosmopolitan connectivity. However, such analyses, which are most often focused on the heritage products themselves, tend to overlook the heterogeneity of the heritage making as a process. As a result, some dismiss these heritage projects as inauthentic reenactments of Orientalist fantasies, all brand and no substance. Others position them as the products of encounters and partnerships between local and global, or as it often is translated, Arab and Western, discourses, experts, audiences, and constituents. By focusing tonight on the grassroots assemblage, conservation, and mobilization of heritage in Soqotra, I'm going to demonstrate, in contrast, first, how heterogeneous and kaleidoscopic these processes can be, and second, how heritage, a nominally conservative endeavor, and revolution, a nominally transformative endeavor, can become part of the same kind of work. So, Soqotra has been in the news in the past couple years. Some of you may have seen articles about this. But it really started gaining more attention from the Western press in 2008 when it became recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site due to the fact that 37% of its species are endemic, so they're found nowhere else in the world. The island is often described, because of this focus on its flora in particular, as otherworldly and isolated. One person recently called it the most alien-looking place on Earth. These descriptions of its supposedly primordial nature haven't changed much since the 18th and 19th century, when a number of British visitors first went and started describing its flora as well. One visitor described its adenium like one of the first efforts of Dame Nature in tree making, happily abandoned by her for her more graceful shapes and forms. Or its Dracaena, like trees made for a child's Noah's Ark. Or its frankincense, as an enormous sea serpent in the act of shedding its skin, so awkwardly contorted and alive it seemed. In part, this focus on its remoteness and isolation is due to its seasonal seclusion during the southwest monsoon. And indeed, for 4 to 5 months of the year, until 1999, one could not get there by dhow. But the same winds that made it unreachable during this period facilitate its connections to a regional food network that have long sustained the islanders. So typically, dhow captains and crew would sail from places like Ajman, Sharjah, Muscat, Ras Al Khaimah, stopping in Soqotra to pick up water and ghee along the way, going to East Africa. They'd returned from East Africa with slaves that were destined for Oman. Some of them jumped ship or stayed there, so there is a small Afro-Soqotran population on the island. But most importantly, what they brought with them was grain. So Soqotrans, unlike this idea that they've been self-sustaining, they've long depended on these grains from East Africa. And then they'd go back to Oman and the UAE with woolen rugs, with dates, as well as with brides. So a lot of Soqotran women ended up marrying these dhow captains. Soqotra is also part of a sultanate of Kishan and Soqotra. Kishan, let me see if I can get, okay, I'll skip that, is in mainland Yemen. And so you also had a lot of traffic from mainland Yemen to Soqotra during this period, although Soqotra was not part of the Yemeni state until 1967, and the sultans remained on the island for most of the 20th century. So, as I mentioned, 1967, Soqotra was part of the sultanate. It was during this period there was also a British protectorate. What is important here is that, and during this period actually, there were a lot of botanists, researchers, administrators who would come and visit the island. During the 1940s, during World War II, it was occupied by the British military. It was a base in the Indian Ocean War, the theater. But in 1967, the Sultanate was abolished, and Soqotra became part of South Yemen. That is the first time it actually became a Yemeni island in that sense. During that period, it was restricted. It was as a military access only. So not that many researchers were able to go there. There were people from the Soviet bloc, but most of their research was ethnographic, anthropological. And so what happened from the 60s onward was there was very little research into its biodiversity, into its, well, what was then considered just its flora, its natural resources. And so there was an assumption that a lot of its plants had gone extinct or endangered. In 1990, when Soqotra became part of the unified Republic of Yemen, because North and South Yemen unified, it opened up again to researchers, tourists, and travelers from broader parts of the world. And with that came the discovery that, in fact, it had this very rich biodiversity. This opening of the island, what Soqotrans call the infitah, the opening, occurred also alongside government investments in its infrastructure. So the government of Yemen laid an all-weather airstrip, which would allow planes to land even during the monsoon season, so now people could go there regularly. It laid a ring road, a mobile cell phone structure, all of these things that were happening shortly before I arrived in the island. And they were new enough that this is a 7th grade class that I used to teach English lessons to. that one of our field trips was to the airport to see the plane land, because these young Soqotrans hadn't seen that before. And also Fridays was the place to be, because there was one flight coming in from Sana'a, and everyone wanted to know who and what was coming in on that flight. So this economic liberalization of the Unified Republic of Yemen in the 90s and early 2000s coincided with a move toward environmental regulation, prompted in part by this rediscovery of Soqotra's biodiversity. During the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, Yemen developed comprehensive environmental regulation, national legislation in terms of the environment. It instated a national environmental action plan, and through this plan, Soqotra became recognized as a national protected area, one of the first in Yemen, and the government ratified a zoning plan by which every part of the island was determined in terms of resource use or protection. You also see that although the entire island became a protected area, there are also nature sanctuaries within the island, and the place that I ended up living in, I'm going to talk about tonight, is one of the red areas on the top right-hand side of the map. The government also introduced a new constitutional amendment stating that each individual shall have a religious and national duty to protect the environment. Given the poverty of the state of Yemen today, but also earlier, this is quite remarkable, and also something that you can only imagine if we had something like that in our constitution here. But Soqotrans didn't encounter this legislation. The way they encountered this legislation coming out of Sana'a was not so much directly as it was through a series of what people call integrated conservation and development projects that started coming to the island in the late 1990s, and there were several phases. And you can see from the name changes that there were slight differences between projects focused on biodiversity, that is research, conservation and development, governance, sustainable development. To the Soqotrans, however, despite the differences in programs, all of them, they refer to all of them as al-Mashrua al-Bia, or the environmental project, and al-Bia for short, the environment. So Soqotrans would say things like, when the environment arrived, we learned about our conservation, or when the environment arrived, we stopped cutting down trees. Now, of course, they're talking about the project, but they were also depicting a new way of thinking about the environment as a distinct object to be governed, managed, abstracted, commoditized, viewed, and consumed for the purpose of saving it. So one day I was driving my car that I finally got after many months of not being able to go anywhere through the island, and one of my passengers flew a Pepsi can out of the window. And I said, "Hey, Albia, the environment." And he said, "This isn't the environment." And he pointed to a little oasis where people would stop and take their goats. He said, "This area is dirty." It wasn't the environment that tourists would come to see. Now, as an anthropologist, my original goal was to document the impacts of these ICDPs on the pastoral populations. To do this, I moved into this newly established protected area that I mentioned in 2004 and lived with a pastoral family. I taught English in the local school. I worked in the new ecotourism campground, often cooking meals behind the scenes, attended meetings of the newly formed Environmental Association, EPA meetings in Hadibo, the main town, and environmental awareness meetings, which is really the primary way that people in the countryside interacted with these projects. Attending these meetings allowed me to observe clashes between UN and local notions of environmental management and governance. Now, I'm not going to go much into what the projects did or didn't do. They actually achieved quite a few things. For instance, because of this zoning legislation, they were able to stop the asphalt ring road from going right through a natural lagoon. They provided people with piped water. They helped people build home gardens. They put in the infrastructure for the ecotourism campgrounds. But despite all this, they also produced several tensions. And one of the main issues was the overarching focus on scientific research at the expense of already existing local environmental knowledge and Islamic precepts. Another was a disconnect between how projects frame the environment and how Soqotrans engage their natural resources and surroundings. So this is an awareness meeting for, again, the group of 7th graders that I was teaching English to. And the head of the environmental awareness team said to them, It used to be that people didn't know about Soqotra, even just 10 years ago, but now the whole world knows about us. Also, we didn't know why our island is important. But after much study, we learned that it is. Because of what? And he tried to elicit commentary. Because of its biodiversity. Why else is Soqotra important? Because of its endemism. 300 out of 900 species are endemic to Soqotra. That means they are not found anywhere else in the world. Now, this focus on endemism, which I see as a perspective from an external gaze, this is important because it doesn't exist outside. We might compare that to what was a kinship metaphor that was used by one of these young students' parents during an environmental awareness meeting for the sheikhs that happened later on. All of us stand ready to conserve our species, he said. We love our trees. They're our trees. They're our wives. They're our children. But if I love my wife and children and tell myself, don't worry, just sit and relax, well, then we'll die of hunger. Now, in addition to this environmental perspective and governance, Soqotrans, or actually very much because of it, Soqotrans were taught how to become, they're trying to move them from being pastoralists to becoming eco-guides for the idea of the throngs of eco-tourists that would come to the island. So Soqotrans were taught what tourists want, why they come to the island. I walked back from one of these trainings one day and my neighbor said, "They're coming all the way here to see our trees? Don't they have trees where they come from?" But they were led to believe that Soqotra, which is now being branded the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean, would bring in lots of tourist revenue, and that this would lead to regular incomes and other forms of development. However, by the mid-2000s, already pretty early on, Soqotrans were becoming frustrated by the increasing regulations on their natural resource use, on road development, tree cutting, etc., in relation to the limited financial gains from tourism. We should remember that the mid-2000s, any article, any journalist that wrote about Yemen would mention that it was the ancestral birthplace of bin Laden. So it was not great for tourism. They also wondered why they had to go through tourism to get development. They were kind of sold this idea that if you have a campground, you'll get lots of tourists, they'll bring in money, you could take that money, then you could build a road that you need so that you have safe access to your village. And they'd come out of a socialist system and wondered why the state couldn't just give them the road in the first place, why they had to go through this detour through tourism to get there. This tension between what Paige West calls conservation as development, the project's commitment to this conservation as development, and Soqotran's desire for development outright is depicted in a poem about the Homel protected area. I'm not going to read this whole poem, but I basically just want to point out that the poet talks about, yes, Homel is beautiful, the trees, the earth, the foliage. Westerners and tourists love you. But if there were only petrol at the foot of the mountains, why then we would live a life of ease. So while I was trying to understand these political struggles, I began to notice the extent to which Soqotrans' debates about environmental projects, their island's future, and their island's past were being articulated through poetry. So much so that I started paying attention to poetry to follow these important conversations. I had to, despite not having quite the linguistic skills for that. It is through poetry that people were discussing the present-day impacts of things like khat, which is this herb that Yemenis chew and that had been introduced to the island, and also growing land disputes that had been exacerbated by these protected area zoning regulations. They were also debating the past. What kind of history and events should be commemorated and what should be forgotten? For instance, in 1974, the Sultan's family members and his wazir were executed by fellow Soqotrans. What do they do about that? That is, at the same time that foreign experts working for the projects and the government were nominating Soqotra as a World Heritage Site, poets and several other Soqotrans began to define, assemble, and promote their cultural heritage as a counter to the natural heritage that was being made global. So in addition to thinking about and looking into the arrival of the environment, I began to focus on the arrival of heritage on the island. What did this mean to various Soqotrans? What was Soqotri heritage? Some would point to customs like maulids or samhair, which would be mixed call and response poetry at night, and say that this is the quintessential aspect of Soqotri heritage. But this was complicated because there was a new religious piety movement that had swept the island, and that made people debate and question the religious permissibility of these kinds of mixed gender poetry, responses, and traditions. Others would point to the dance troupes and drumming traditions, especially dance troupes who were often called upon to perform in front of the tourists that were coming to the island. This was seen as problematic, also because, hey, mixed gender dancing, if poetry is problematic, then the dancing is another thing. But again, this drumming worried people in terms of thinking about notions like piety. So one of the drummers of one of these troupes told me that one of his neighbors had come up to him and said, and asked him to stop drumming, and said, if you just stop drumming, we will build you a new house. And the drummer thought about it, but as he was walking home and hearing the sounds of the tabla, this drum all around him, he realized it'd be unthinkable for him to give this up. He told me that he had told them, I'm sorry, I can't stop drumming. Drumming was passed down to from my parents to me, and from their parents to them. Drumming was his inheritance, his heritage. So he didn't stop, nor did he receive a new house. But these were debates then about piety, but also about modernity. What do we do about the fact that we used to believe in witchcraft? And also about identity. After all, the dance troupes are primarily constituted by the Afro-Soqotran population, so it's a question about who gets to speak for notions of Soqotran identity and heritage. Is it the indigenous Soqotrans, the Arab Soqotrans, the African Soqotrans? Still others tried to revitalize and capitalize on traditional ecological knowledge, such as the use of natural remedies, which were no longer in fashion. Already in the late 19th century, British visitors to the island would remark upon how all the Soqotrans clamored for pills. So this notion that they were using these dragon's blood trees and things didn't really stick, except that my friend Tanouf had learned the use of medicinal plants from his father and had guided many botanists and researchers around the island, but was never hired by any of the environmental projects for a variety of reasons, probably because he didn't speak English and didn't have kind of formal educational training. So he opened up a pharmacy, despite Soqotrans, this being the first herbal pharmacy on the island ever, and treated many women successfully, he says, for infertility. When I would visit the island, it was after doing my first fieldwork there, the pharmacy was constantly full of people coming from Yemen, but also from Saudi Arabia and further afield to purchase these herbs. For most people, however, the quintessence of heritage was their language and, again, their poetry. Many Soqotrans were far less concerned about the environmental impacts of the road, for instance, than they were about the negative impacts of Arabic on their endangered Soqotri language. This is a picture of my friend Ismail, who I profile in the book. He'd been born in the countryside but grew up in Hadibo. And he realized how un-Soqotri, in his view, he was one day when he was going to visit a village out in the countryside with a friend, and they came across a sick goat. And they tried to do something, they didn't know what to do. They went to the closest village and they said, there's a goat, it's sick. And the villagers said, well, what color, what does it look like? And they said, brown. And the villager said, no, what are its markings? And Ismail and his friend realized that they didn't know. To them, a goat was a goat. To the villagers, a goat was like a child. How would you not know what goat you had seen? So he decided that he had to learn his way into being Soqotran, which he tried to do by going around the island and collecting old poetry and old stories. And this is his collection of cassette poetry you see there. He also worked for the environment, first as a driver and then as a guide. And in doing so, he learned that languages can become endangered too. All the problems of heritage and Soqotri language, they became my problem, he said. I started worrying about issues of language and heritage loss, because I have evidence for how this language will end. I am evidence of this. Another person I profile in the book is a person named Fahid, seen here in a pink shirt. He was also born in the countryside. He became an Arabic language teacher, a reporter, a mosque preacher. In January 2004, shortly before I moved to the island, Günter Grass, the German Nobel Prize-winning author, visited Home Hill, the very area where I was living, and the project staged a poetry reading underneath the dragon's blood trees. So they called in Fahid to translate from Soqotri to Arabic, and then they had somebody else translate from Arabic into English, and I don't know if they went to German or not. The fact that this Nobel Prize-winning author showed interest in translations of translations convinced Fahid that it wasn't environment or tourism potential that distinguishes Soqotra, but rather that it was its poetry that could place Soqotra on the global stage and be what he called its ambassador. This led him, as well as some others, to create a Society for History and Heritage in 2005, which sought to preserve Soqotran heritage, incidentally in the same year that the Abu Dhabi government created ADASH, the Authority for Heritage and Culture in Abu Dhabi. But these were independent projects. At this time, in the mid-2000s, there was a sense that there were all these people grasping at different pieces, but no one really knew what it was that they were doing or what they were trying to put it together. Fahad explains it like this. Heritage is like a buried body everyone is trying to revive. One is pulling at the ear, one is pulling at the leg. What's going to happen in the end is that each person is going to dig up a part, but they won't be able to put it back together. It's very Humpty Dumpty-esque, kind of. And if this was not confusing enough, it was during this same period in the mid to late 2000s that members of the Soqotran diaspora, themselves influenced by heritage projects in the Gulf, started mounting their own heritage and cultural projects on the island. In my book, I talk about various waves of migration from Soqotra to the Gulf. Much of it was economic. Soqotrans worked in pearling in the Gulf. There was also a lot of marriage, intermarriage. I've alluded to that earlier. But in 67 to the 70s, there was this prohibition on travel outside of the state. By 72, Soqotrans really couldn't leave the island without permission. So between 67 and 72, there were boatloads of Soqotrans that were leaving the island each year, afraid of what they saw as the socialist takeover of their island and the abolishment of the Sultanate. They traveled to the Gulf states. Personal interviews and archival records show the willingness of what was then Trucial state leaders to accept them, despite the British saying, no, these could be Adenese. But what I found most interesting was precisely this generation of 60s, 67, 70s, men who ended up, because they had escaped what they considered this new revolutionary regime in South Yemen, they ended up joining forces. They joined Sultan Qaboos's forces to fight against what was then the Dhofar rebellion happening in the western part of Oman, to try and help Sultan Qaboos put down the Dhofar revolutionaries who were supported by the state of South Yemen. So it was Soqotrans who were fighting their own state in Oman with the hope that once they squashed that revolution, that the Sultan of Oman would help liberate the island from the revolutionaries there. One person said to me that he was thinking about this as, how can we return to Soqotra without putting out the fire here? And they spent months on the empty quarter, on the fringes. Eventually, this never happened, but they did eventually receive Omani citizenship for their service or made their way to the UAE. But because they fought against South Yemen, none were able to return to the island until 1990 is when Yemen became unified, but really until 1994 when the Socialist Party declined after the civil war in Yemen. It's this generation that became invested in defining Soqotran heritage, identity, and culture against the international state and local attempts to do so, especially when they returned after 20 years to find these memories, these remnants of the Sultanate past in ruins. And in my book, I discuss this generation's efforts to take ownership of their island's history, to avenge the executions that happened in 1974, and to reorient Soqotra's heritage from nature to culture, and from a celebration of Soqotran indigeneity to a focus on an insistence on Arab identity, and from the focus on the Yemeni nation to the transnational Gulf. Much of their thinking was influenced by their experiences growing up in Oman and fighting for Oman, and also the Omani Renaissance, or Nahda, they had witnessed, as well as models of heritage villages, museums, and festivals in Oman and the UAE. We see this in the private museum created by Ahmed Saad. This is the same man, now as an older gentleman, that you saw in the earlier photograph, who returned to the island and opened up the first and only museum of Soqotra on Soqotra in 2008, the same year that Soqotra became a World Heritage Site for its natural heritage. We see this also in a festival paid for by Soqotrans in the UAE and Oman that was modeled after a festival that had been created by ADASH, the Abu Dhabi Authority for Heritage and Culture, in 2005. This festival also started in 2008, the same year that Soqotra became a World Heritage Site, and ran for 5 consecutive years. And you see this modeling is quite deliberate. So what you see in the top left-hand corner are the Abu Dhabi panel of experts, the jury, and you see the panel in Soqotra on the right. This was quite different from the poetry that you saw earlier, right? Here it's on a stage, you have a jury. And you see the contestants waiting to see who's going to go on to the next round, bottom left, and then the Soqotran pastoralist poets nervously waiting to see who's going to go on to the next round there. These were relatively small scale compared to Abu Dhabi. They weren't televised, and they were privately funded, but they had a large impact on Soqotrans who had attended, who had not seen poetry performed in this fashion, or if they had, it was never Soqotri language poetry. It would be an Arabic qasida, a formal poem, but it would never be the kind of poetry in Soqotri, because they had actually been taught during all these years that Soqotri is a language of the home, and it's not something you would use for official events. The jury was tasked with evaluating the merits of each poem according to its linguistic integrity. So the poets had to create new poetry. After some 40 years of Arabization, they actually had to create new poetry that would only have Soqotri words in it. And that also kind of forced them to focus on the Sultanate past, because all kinds of words like environment, heritage, the state, Soqotrans had no Soqotri lexicon for. This was all Arabic. Now, what I'm going to show you, for those of you who speak Arabic, I'm going to show you a 1-minute clip of the winning poem of 2008, the first year, and you'll hear what's not Arabic, but you'll also hear how Arabic infuses this poem as well. And this was considered a winning poem for its focus on Soqotri language. The focus on the past was, on the one hand, nostalgic, on the other hand, due to this linguistic parameters, which I mentioned, but also because people were really afraid. This was, they were nervous about trying to forward something that was not Yemeni heritage. And you see this in the number of slogans that were put up around Hadibo, posters saying things like, Soqotri heritage is pure Yemeni heritage. It belongs to the great Yemeni nation. And so in this first tentative year and years, the contest organizers sought to frame their cultural heritage as a necessary ingredient of the nation state, and therefore requiring or deserving of national recognition. In contrast to the foreign experts' framing of Soqotra's environmental heritage as being so unique that it needed international protection. I talked about the arrival of the environment, the arrival of heritage. Now I'm going to quickly gloss the arrival of the revolution. In 2011, Soqotrans talk about new ways of speaking, feeling, arriving on the island. People didn't feel timid anymore. They took to the streets, daily protests demanding the resignation of the Yemeni president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, but also the end to the corruption in Soqotra. So they took to the streets not only to protest for the end of the regime, but they cleaned it metaphorically. They tried to get rid of khat, this plant, and other northern Yemeni influences, and they also cleaned it literally. During this period in 2011, 2012, a lot of the foreign NGOs and development organizations left the island, leaving a vacuum in their place. So it was the Soqotran youth who decided, you know, if somebody's going to take care of the environment, now it has to be us. So they went around cleaning up, sweeping all the streets and taking out the trash, which the environmental projects had been trying to cajole people to do for the whole decade before, when everyone would watch and say, well, that's ridiculous. The same people who were organizing these demonstrations to change the regime were continuing to organize the heritage festivals during the same days to preserve their culture. And the festival became a platform for this new critique, and the poems were no longer timid. Far from being focused on this nostalgic Sultanate past, they criticized President Ali Abdullah Saleh and his cronies. They likened them to a countrywide infestation of fleas requiring extermination, to travelers on a ship at port, which when it finally departs is going to sink from the burden of all its stolen cargo, to a lumbering camel that has irritated otherwise harmless bees that are now swarming and attacking. And for my friend Fahid, who I mentioned, it was this political platform, but it was more than that. The festival accomplished several things. It encouraged the production and advancement of new Soqotri language poetry, which had been one of his first aims. And it also helped to instill in Soqotrans not only a love for their heritage, but also the popular consciousness that he knew to be requisite for any large-scale social change. I'm going to show you a 2-minute clip of him addressing the festival on its opening night. A natural politician, he's now the Minister of Fisheries for Yemen. But You may have noticed, actually, that he was addressing the crowds in Arabic, despite this language about Soqotri, the importance of Soqotri language, because in fact, when the panel of jury, when the jury tried to actually evaluate the Soqotri poems one night in Soqotri, after doing so in Arabic for many nights, people were protesting, saying, "Wait a minute, this is a Soqotri Poetry Festival, and you're speaking Arabic." They did so, and the audience snickered. It was just such a disconnect for them to hear people speak Soqotri in an official setting and capacity. In any case, after 5 nights of politically inspired poems, Fahd returned to his message for a cultural revolution. I hope that the revolution here is a cultural one and includes literature, poetry, and stories, and produces new values alongside a rejection of the old ones. This is a worthy project. Worthy, perhaps, but also not an easy one, which is a sentiment captured in one of the lines of the winning poems of 2011. We've been struck by these powerful storms, and all we have are these wooden dugouts. So the revolution brought down President Ali Abdullah Saleh, and beginning there was optimism for a political solution. In fact, of all the places in the Arab world that have experienced revolutions, Yemen showed a lot of hope for promise in the beginning. From 2013 to 2014, there was a 10-month national dialogue conference that brought together members of all different factions. They met in Sana'a to debate the future of the country, to draft a new constitution. And this group of about some 500 people included 3 Soqotrans, among them Fahd, and some people from Mahra. Empowered by the spirit and of the demonstrations and the festival, this festival that had happened for 5 years, and you see Fahd basically kind of training himself to become a politician through that. And by years of having assembled and mobilized their cultural heritage, these Soqotrans were able to call for changes in the draft constitution for a new Yemen. So Yemen's the Constitution of the Unified Republic of Yemen is fairly standard for an Arab majority state. The first article, Yemen is an Arab Islamic sovereign state. Article 2, Islam is the religion of the state, and Arabic its official language. And Article 3 points to Islamic Sharia as the source of all legislation. Before unification, it was a source of legislation. When the draft constitution was approved by this body, they kept Article 1 and 2 more or less as it was, but they inserted an Article 3. The state shall pay special attention to both the Mehri and Soqotri languages, above Islamic Sharia as the source of all legislation. This is quite remarkable because very few constitutions of Arab majority states have this constitutional level protections for endangered languages. It is also remarkable because at the time, the estimate is that the total population of the governorate of Soqotra, became a governorate in 2013, the governorates of Soqotra and Mahra was 0.0068%. So less than 1/10 of 1% of the population, less than 1/10 of 1%, sorry, was able to affect this, was able to get this recognition in the Constitution. So, due to time constraints, I'm going to stop here. To conclude, what I've tried to show you is what a group of everyday Soqotrans were able to achieve through their mobilization of cultural heritage during a time of crisis before the war. My book does this in greater detail by examining the ways in which heritage, albia, and turath, the environment and heritage, albia and turath, as discursive practices, governing regimes, and material objects were introduced to a people at the cultural and geographic margins of the so-called Arab world. It traces how, at a time that the archipelago was inscribed as a natural World Heritage Site for its biological diversity and threatened species, Soqotrans with varying degrees of formal education took to salvaging, performing, and promoting what they considered to be a threatened cultural heritage. This is significant for it shows how heritage and revolution can become part of the same work. In fact, I argue that these Soqotrans embarked on what the Syrian scholar Tayyib Tizani once called a Tawra Turathiyya, a heritageal revolution, meaning not only a revolution in the cognitive understanding of heritage, but also a revolution grounded in the progressive elements of heritage. Following Soqotrans' public recognition of the right to use, celebrate, and transmit to future generations their formerly ostracized language through annual poetry festivals, which were modeled after similar but institutional attempts to shore up the use of Arabic among the English-inundated youth of the Gulf, Soqotran and Mehra delegates to the National Dialogue Conference were emboldened to insist on inscribing constitutional protections for their endangered languages. Although it is unclear and, in fact, basically more and more unlikely that this draft constitution will ever again see the light of day, it is clear that these attempts to readjust the political imbalances in Yemen were grounded in some of the most progressive elements of heritage, protections for endemic languages that teeter on the edge of extinction. This shows us how grassroots claims to heritage can be a powerful form of political engagement with the most imminent concerns of the present: human rights, globalization, democracy, and sustainability. Further, it shows us how, in contexts like these, heritage from below is not only a worthy and potentially revolutionary project, but it is likely to come to matter all the more. Thank you.